Good evening. Right now, it's generally hot everywhere in Moscow. I think it will be hot here as well. Although from the very beginning I must say two things. First of all, I have to say, and people write to me about this very often on the internet, that I am not a specialist, that I am a layman. Yes, that is true. I am not a specialist. I don't know history, that is indeed the case. I am just like the people sitting on the other side of the screen, and perhaps I even know less than you do. I simply want to try to understand what Fomenko is saying and what his opponents are saying. That is why we invited today Yury Afanasiev, a person whom I personally deeply respect for everything you have done both as a historian and as someone who makes history. Not long ago I took part in recording the show, Old Apartment, where they talked about that famous Congress of People's Deputies and showed your speeches. So, I want to say right away, however much our views on history may differ, I will respect you in any case.
Thank you.
I am not going to defend Fomenko's theory, and I hope I won't have to do that, because I am not its supporter. It's not that I am its opponent either, I am simply trying to understand it, and that's all. Enough with the preface, let's begin. We will start with your first question, because your first question is also my first question, which I will then ask you. Please, here is an interactive question that Yury Nikolaevich would like to ask our viewers.
I would like to ask the viewers what they think. Is there an ideological foundation in the works of Fomenko and his supporters?
I must tell you that frankly, I don't even really understand this question, but judging by the fact that you are asking it, you answer it in the affirmative.
Naturally, yes.
Please explain your position.
I would like to explain it as follows. From my point of view, the works of Fomenko and his supporters do not remain the same over time. They also have their own history and their own evolution. When Fomenko and his colleagues began this so-called new chronology, it seemed to me that his impulses were noble in the sense that he wanted to provide some additional arguments to those who are interested in history and who study it professionally. Perhaps in the form of questions and doubts that were drawn primarily and mainly from astronomy. Later he supplemented them with the theory of mathematical statistics. In addition to this, he tried to bring in some linguistic data, though less so at the beginning. At the outset, he subjected traditional methods to criticism, even such ones as dendrochronology.
I apologize for interrupting you. The thing is, in my opinion, we've talked about this for maybe 5 broadcasts already, and all of this is well known. So, if possible and if it's not too difficult, I had put a question to you. In your view, what is the ideological basis of Fomenko's theory? If you could, please talk about that, because there's so much one would like to discuss, and I'm afraid we won't have time.
In that case, those who are interested in this issue should be referred to the latest books that came out relatively recently. These are 2 books, The Empire and The Conspiracy Against History. If you look at them carefully, the essence of these books boils down to substantiating the claim that somewhere in the 14th century there existed the Great Russia Horde, which included Western Europe, North Africa, Central Asia, India, and China. These countries were supposedly under this very Russia horde. They paid tribute. Some kinds of orders and directives were sent there from Moscow. These orders were carried out there. Then, as a result of certain conspiracies, starting in the 17th century, Russia began to shrink. It shrank almost to present-day Russia. Although there were times, say at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries, when it once again acquired almost the same borders it had before.
So, what is the ideological basis of this? I'm not saying that this is how it was. Maybe it was so, maybe it wasn't. We didn't live back then.
The point is that today, many people really believe that Russia is going through some kind of tragedy, and that Russians are experiencing a misfortune. Very many people feel offended and even humiliated. Because there used to be a great power that stood on equal footing with the United States, maintained military parity with the entire world. And then suddenly it became weak, incapable of anything. No one listens to it anymore. Everyone treats it condescendingly. The last 10 years have shaken people's faith in the future. People look to the future with uncertainty. And with the help of these books, they construct for themselves a beautiful past.
Let's sort this out. So, are you saying that people don't want to think about the future and want to think about the past? Is that the ideological basis? But those words could be applied to any historian. And they could be applied, say, to any author of science fiction novels.
No, that's not it.
Then what is it?
The thing is that in the book The Empire, a map of this 14th century empire is given, which includes northern Egypt, that is, North Africa, China, and India. And it is said that quite recently things were like this, that this was what Russia Horde was like.
I've seen that map. Maybe I'm a unique person, maybe you're a different kind of person. I feel a sense of pride from this. I think that there was such a wonderful Russia, that we have such a wonderful country. Moreover, I proceed from the idea that if Russia was such a great and enormous country, that doesn't mean that the countries around it were worse. It's just that every country has its own history. Ours is like this. You think that's not the point?
The point is that Russia was never like that.
That's a second question, which we can discuss. What is the ideological underpinning?
The ideological underpinning is that right now these feelings of national humiliation are so strong, so real, that any attempt to stoke these feelings.
But on the contrary, Fomenko is saying the opposite. Guys, we live in a great country. It had different stages in its history, it expanded, it contracted. Don't worry, we live in a good country.
Fine, but the point is that this is a fiction. You see, it's a myth, it's a fabrication.
But right now you're not talking about whether Fomenko is right or wrong. You're talking about the fact that there is an ideological basis in this theory.
That is exactly where the ideological basis lies. When instead of facts and logic some kind of myth and fiction are substituted.
Then that could just be a mistake.
Yes, but that's precisely what works on this inflamed national consciousness we have right now. It fuels it.
Tell me, where am I wrong? There is some historian, it doesn't matter whether it's Fomenko, Petrov, or Ivanov, who says that we live in a country with a great history. And that in this great history the country went through different periods. It was huge, then it shrank, and at the same time people lived there normally and existed normally. Why does that have a bad effect on people's consciousness?
Because it isn't true, because it's a lie. From my point of view, it's a lie. Never was Russia Horde.
I'm not saying whether it's true or false. But a lie can be, for example, a lie for salvation.
Well, fine, if you want more lies for salvation.
I'm not trying to understand right now whether Fomenko is right or wrong, but what is the ideological basis of his teaching? So far, I can't understand it.
The ideology lies precisely in the desire to play along with those moods, even when those moods are unhealthy, even when they are the moods of an inflamed mind and wounded self-esteem. When someone is told, you're already mistaken, well then, to make the leaven stronger, here you go, take this Russia as well, the one that included China, Africa, and so on. That is ideology in the purest form.
Let's assume that Fomenko is right.
Fine, then I can put it differently. For example, when Lenin and the Bolsheviks were justifying the need to progress into the future, they based their ideology on economic doctrines that claimed that the working class was better than the others, more just than the others, and that it would lead the nation forward into a bright future. Hitler, instead of economics, took biology and said that only a pure Aryan race could unite not only the nation but ultimately the entire world. In both cases, these were purely ideological constructs.
I'll tell you that.
Right, let me finish. And with Fomenko it's not economics, it's not biology, rather, the past itself serves as this kind of leaven, so that states of mind and moods that are already unhealthy become even more unhealthy.
It seems to me that comparing a scholar to politicians is not entirely appropriate. But that's not even the main point. The point is that, as you yourself just said, Lenin and Hitler claimed that someone was better than someone else, and everything was built on that. Workers were better than petty townspeople and the bourgeoisie. Fomenko never anywhere says that someone is better than someone else.
That's not true. When Fomenko says that Western Europe paid tribute to Russia, or when he says that the Russians founded Rome, and when he depicts the Capitoline wolf with those very boys under it, suckling the wolf, and says that these are Russian boys, excuse me, but what is that?
When traditional historians say that for 380 years the Mongols oppressed Russia, are they saying that the Mongols are better than the Russians?
No, let's wait a moment. The thing is that when people say the Mongols oppressed the Russians, that needs clarification. How was it? What was it really like?
From the point of view of traditional history, there was a Tatar-Mongol invasion. So, does that mean the Mongols are better than the Russians?
No. What does "the Mongols are better than the Russians" have to do with it?
If the Russians founded Rome, and on that basis, they're better than the Italians, then following that logic, which seems incorrect to me, the Mongols, who conquered Russia, are better than the Russians.
No. First of all, I'm not claiming anything like that. I'm not saying that the Mongols are better than the Russians, or that the Russians are better than the Italians. Makes sense? I'm talking about something entirely different.
But you were the one talking about Hitler and Lenin, who said that someone was better than someone else. And you say that Fomenko is doing the same thing. You bring up Rome as an example. I want to understand concretely, what exactly does Fomenko say that is problematic?
Fomenko says that there was a time, and that this time repeated itself 3 times, when, in the 14th century, there existed a Russia horde that, in essence, ruled the entire world. Then, at the beginning of the 20th century, Russia controlled a territory roughly half that size. And then, during the period of the Soviet Union and the Socialist Bloc, Russia once again expanded to approximately the same state it had been in during the 14th century. I consider this to be a purely ideological construct, based precisely on the fact that Fomenko sets Russia horde in opposition to the rest of the world. He explicitly says that the Russian language influenced the formation of Latin as well as Arabic, and that the Russians founded Rome. Ultimately, this is an ideology illusion, which is now being presented as a kind of pill, precisely at this moment.
It seems to me that you're not saying something. What does the ideology consist of? Ideology has to consist of something. What does it consist of?
The ideology consists precisely in this: that we once lived well, and that the bad West, through its protégés, the Romanov dynasty, plunged Russia into chaos.
So, in your view, Fomenko does in fact claim that Russia is better than the West?
Naturally, not just better than the West, it ruled that West.
And when traditional historians say that the Mongols conquered Russia, they are not claiming that the Mongols are better than the Russians. Then I don't understand the logic. Either it's one or the other.
These things are not comparable.
Why not?
Because they're not. There were Mongols.
If you say that Russia conquered the West, and therefore Fomenko is claiming...
Not for that reason.
Then why?
Not for that reason. It's not just that it conquered the West. It turns out that it founded Rome. It turns out that it imposed tribute on the West. And it turns out that it issued directives to the West, for example, during the time of Ivan III, about how the West had become undisciplined.
All of this does not imply that Russia is better than the West. It implies that things were as the historian claims they were, that is how it was.
The West is the enemy.
Why?
The West is alien. That is precisely Fomenko's theory.
A theory that things were simply that way, not because someone was better than someone else, but because that's how it was. That's what Fomenko claims. Let's take the question.
Hello, I have a question for Afanasiev. A few days ago, on the radio station Echo of Moscow, you, a respected figure, referred to a major scholar in our country, the mathematician Fomenko, saying that his views reflected a blend of communist and Nazi ideology. Don't you think that this statement of yours about Fomenko is far more ideologized than what you saw in his works? Thank you.
The point is that if one states that in certain works or in certain claims there is an element of ideology, an element of politicization, then one inevitably has to speak about what kind it is, what nature it has. Therefore, I believe there are indeed sufficient grounds to speak of a fascist, brown coloring when one holds in one's hands Fomenko's book The Empire or the smaller book The Conspiracy Against Russian History.
In general, it seems to me that attaching any kind of labels to scholars is wrong, regardless of what those scholars are engaged in. No matter what, I can say once again that I treat you with great respect. But I remember when the Interregional Deputies Group emerged, what words your enemies used to call you. So, it seems to me that when labels are attached, that is incorrect. But I think that your position regarding Fomenko's ideology is absolutely clear. Another matter is that one can argue with it. Now I would like to sort out some things that, for me, as I emphasize once again, a non-specialist in history, were striking. I want to ask you about the Battle of Kulikovo. I have several questions. According to traditional history, the Battle of Kulikovo took place in Tula Oblast. I have everything written down because I might lose my train of thought. It took place in Tula Oblast between the Don and the Nepriadva rivers. Is that correct?
Yes.
This was a battle in which tens of thousands of warriors took part on both sides. Correct?
Yes, many.
Excavations have been carried out many times, but nothing was found? They didn't find the remains of all these people. Why?
Yes, that's not a simple question. Because, indeed, the site of the Battle of Kulikovo, to within some kilometer, or even tens of kilometers, has still not been precisely determined.
But there's a field, a monument.
Yes, there may be a field.
So, isn't it really about that? It can't be trusted?
But as far as I know, no serious historians have so far made claims that the battle took place precisely on that field.
It's written in all the textbooks. I specifically checked a textbook.
It says that it was approximately there.
Yury Nikolaevich, explain this to me from the point of view of logic. A battle involving many thousands took place God knows when. To this day they can't find the location, but roughly it's clear, between the rivers, what are they called? The Don and the Nepriadva. It's roughly clear where that is, isn't it?
Well, roughly, yes.
So, why can't they find anything?
You see, if this were the only place where a battle had taken place, including such a major battle, and it could not be identified precisely, then unfortunately world history contains quite a few such cases. Indeed, it is not so easy to do.
On what basis then, do traditional historians conclude that the Battle of Kulikovo took place precisely in this location?
On the basis of many pieces of evidence. The thing is, there are accounts of how the army advanced, for example.
What do you mean by evidence?
Well, sources.
What kind of sources?
Primarily written sources.
From that period?
From that period, of course.
How do we know they're from that period?
You see, if you start questioning me like this about every single episode, then…
I'm trying to understand. Isn't that allowed? If it isn't, I won't.
No. Unfortunately, you know, I am a historian. Yes, my specialization is the history of historical scholarship. But if you interrogate me with such insistence…
I'm trying to sort this out.
Wait. At least to within a kilometer, where the Battle of Kulikovo took place. After that, one can, for example, go through such points as… the chronology of pharaohs, princes, Chinese emperors. I don't think any historian would be able to name the exact dates of the lives or reigns of pharaohs, princes, and emperors. But on that basis, neither you nor someone questioning me has grounds to declare. Then what is there to talk to you about? If no arrowheads were found, if no traces at all were found anywhere, then on what basis can one say that the Battle of Kulikovo took place approximately in this location?
And why is it not permissible to ask that?
And I am answering that there are accounts of how this army was formed and how it moved there. But at the same time, here's the thing. If I were claiming that absolutely everything about the Battle of Kulikovo is known. On the contrary, I believe that even in serious works on the Battle of Kulikovo there are many fabrications, many myths, if you like. Because about Dmitry Donskoy himself, for example, it is said that he fought against the Tatar-Mongol yoke. If there were miracles in a time machine, and if this were said to Dmitry Donskoy himself, he would say, Jesus Christ, what are you talking about? I fought against Mamai, and Mamai was just as much an enemy of the Horde as he was of Russia. Because he was not a Chinggisid, that is, he was not a descendant of Genghis Khan. And when Dmitry Donskoy defeated him, Tokhtamish sent him a message of congratulations that he had managed to defeat a common enemy. Makes sense?
We'll definitely come back to this in a moment. It's just that I always feel uncomfortable when people call in wanting to ask something and we don't give them the floor. Please, Makar.
And not only calls, messages are also coming in on the pager. By the way, Tatiana got through with the question, how many books by Anatoly Fomenko has our respected guest read? And a question from the pager, do you think history develops according to laws or chaotically? Thank you in advance, Valentina Petrovna.
I can't say exactly how many books I have read. I think I've read all the main books by Fomenko and his supporters. Not in one sitting. This was over the course of several years. By the way, when I read the first books, I had the idea of making them available to students. More than that, to turn them into something like a didactic tool. To familiarize students properly, give them the opportunity to read these books and say something about them. and thereby spark additional interest. To create something like a provocation, look at the kinds of claims being made, and what can be said against them from the publications that exist in historical scholarship, from our lecturers and professors. In principle, that would have been a good approach. But I'm saying that the evolution of Fomenko himself is obvious. And his movement toward greater ideologization and politicization fills me with doubts.
As for whether history develops according to laws or not,
No, I don't know what laws of history are. Or rather, I know what Marxism says about this. But personally, I don't think history develops according to laws. You can trace certain tendencies, perhaps. At best, some regularities, but there are no laws of history.
you said that it is known roughly where the Battle of Kulikovo took place, and that according to the sources, these particular people fought in it. As I understand from our conversations with Andrei Podvoenitsyn, the biggest problem is precisely the dating of the sources. How is it known that these really are sources? That they belong to contemporaries of those events, and were not copied at some later time? How is that determined?
It is determined in many ways. The thing is that within historical scholarship there is a discipline called the history of chronicle writing. First of all, the material on which a given text is written is studied. In our case, that material is usually paper. Many sources are written on paper with filigrees, that is, watermarks. These watermarks can be dated with an accuracy of about 10 to 15 years.
How is that done?
It's done as follows. Filigrees are essentially a kind of mold used in making paper. Over time, this mold wears out, certain edges are rubbed down, and it becomes less distinct. Then the mold is replaced. For example, the bull's head with a cross. That is the filigree on which all our chronicles were written. But that's only one method.
As far as I know, the only way to determine the age of a tablet, papyrus, or paper is radiocarbon dating. And regarding this method, as far as I know, there are two absolutely opposite points of view. And there is no proof for either side. Some say it is a very precise method and prove that. Others say it is completely imprecise and prove that as well. No other way of determining the time when documents were written exists, as far as I've read in books. Or is that not the case?
Of course not. I'm telling you that it's possible to date texts by filigrees, that is, by the material on which a particular text was written. You can also determine dates by language. That's a fairly accurate method as well. You can date texts by handwriting. And besides that, there are several other cross-checking methods. After all, documents were not created in isolation at any given time. Several texts existed in parallel.
But you do have to start from something.
I'm saying that there are several ways to establish the date of a given text. The method you mentioned is also applicable, especially when we are talking about parchment.
Do you believe in this analysis?
You see, it's not so much a matter of belief. That word isn't quite appropriate.
Do you consider it possible, valid?
Absolutely. This method was invented by physicists, and Libby received the Nobel Prize for it. Since its invention, the method has undergone significant development and refinement. But again, this method does not operate in isolation. For example, it works in conjunction with another method known as dendrochronology. This is also a fairly accurate method of relative dating. Taken together, these two physical methods provide very precise absolute and relative dating.
It's not entirely clear, but still, your position is understandable. Please, let's take the next call.
Tell me please, how do you view Fomenko's claim that the Radziwill Chronicle and the Tale of Bygone Years were forged in the 18th century and are not, in fact, primary sources?
Yes, I have read those passages in the works of Fomenko and his supporters. This may be the most illustrative example. Indeed, Fomenko undertook a critique of the Radziwill Chronicle, more precisely, of one of its copies that contains the Tale of Bygone Years. He argues that 2 pages were inserted into this chronicle in the 18th century. As far as I remember and understand it, that is the essence of his argument. One of these pages discusses the calling of the Varangians, and the other sets out the general chronology of Russian history as recorded in the Radziwill Chronicle. For those who professionally study the history of chronicle writing, Fomenko provides no indisputable proof. That is, if someone were sitting here who specializes professionally in the study of chronicles, they could refer you, for example, to Alexei Shakhmatov and to their own research. In particular, we have historians who work in this field and who demonstrate that attempts to substantiate what Fomenko is arguing are completely unfounded.
So, what you're saying is that all of this more or less has to be taken on faith. Let's sum it up. Is there an ideological foundation in the works of Fomenko and his supporters? I'd like to wrap up this poll so we can move on to the next question. Just in case, we wrote it down for you. Overall, the opinions are almost evenly split. Slightly more people think the answer is yes, 113 people. 103 people say no. In other words, that's within an acceptable margin of error. Opinions are divided right down the middle. You think there is ideology involved. I think that approaching historical books and scholarly works from an ideological standpoint is not necessary at all. Everyone has stayed with their own opinion.
You're saying that one should not approach a scholar using ideological yardsticks at all, right? I completely agree with you on that.
It seems to me you even fought for that position.
I completely agree with you. But when we're talking about a scholar, after all, I am not talking about Fomenko as a mathematician.
No, that's...
Wait a moment.
Only God can say whether someone is truly a scholar or not. I think that when Galileo said that the earth revolves around the sun, everyone told him he was a charlatan. You never really know.
Well, you see, when you hear things like this, and in Fomenko's works it's on practically every page, those historians, roughly in that vein, followed by all kinds of epithets.
I don't use epithets.
No, I'm talking about Fomenko. He uses them, and he has scattered a great many of them throughout all his works.
He never said anything like that, not even close. He didn't talk about fascists.
But I didn't talk about fascists either.
About Nazi brown shirt ideology.
I phrased it more cautiously.
About brown ideological coloration.
That's the point. There are, in fact, quite a lot of such epithets there. It seems to me that everywhere Fomenko and his supporters deal with history, linguistics, art, dating, texts, or chronicle studies, they act not merely as amateurs, but as militant amateurs. That is, they assume that craft and professional expertise are simply unnecessary here. Someone just comes along, opens a folder of documents, sees the title, Radziwill Chronicle, and that alone is supposedly enough to start analyzing it.
I don't really want to discuss the figure of Fomenko, but right now you're describing some kind of terrible person. Yet we're talking about a scholar, a person with a scholarly mind, a major mathematician, which is not disputed. What you're describing simply doesn't align with being a major mathematician. It seems to me that a major scholar simply cannot behave this way. If I were writing a play about a major scholar who is outstanding in one field and then comes along and does all this, people would say, that doesn't happen. A person is one whole being, with one mind. He can't behave one way here and completely differently there. How is that possible? He's a scholar. A scholar cannot approach science in the way you're describing.
If he leaves the field in which he is a professional scholar and enters a field where he is an amateur, he allows himself things he would never allow himself otherwise. Because if you go through his works page by page, and look at those places where history is discussed, or heraldry, for example, or chronology, or texts, or the overall coherence and systematic nature of historical analysis, you simply won't be able to leave a single page without pointing out where militant incompetence not only shows through, but where it is outright raging and flourishing.
Unfortunately, to conduct a discussion at such a concrete level, one needs a scholarly opponent.
May I give a very specific example? Fomenko and his supporters very much needed to explain who St. George the Victory Bearer is, and why he kills a dragon with a spear. Several pages are devoted to this. There is a direct claim. Fomenko says that if you look at old seals, they depict not just a dragon, but a unicorn. A great deal of emphasis is placed on this unicorn. Why? In order then to move on to Constantinople and say that the golden horn is precisely that horn which St. George defeats. And under St. George the Victory Bearer, as you remember, appears Rurik or Yury Dolgoruki. Ultimately, it is Russia defeating Constantinople. That is, the dragon unicorn is a symbol that represents Constantinople.
You know what you were saying, so what? Maybe it was like that, maybe it wasn't.
The point is that all the seals that have survived at all, and those available to anyone, including Fomenko, are kept in the Russian State Archive of Ancient Documents. Anyone can go there and look at them. There is not a single seal there depicting a dragon with one horn. All the dragons have two horns. And if you look at the book The Empire, you will see Saint George the Victory Bearer across the entire cover, and the dragon is two-horned.
Well, maybe. I'm telling you that unfortunately we wanted.
But there is a whole page devoted to the idea that a unicorn is lying there. Do you understand what I mean?
We wanted to seat you together with Garry Kasparov, who adheres to Fomenko's point of view. You said it would be better for us to speak with you one-on-one. I'm not a specialist in this.
But Garry isn't a specialist either.
But Garry is more of a specialist than I am, at least as he sees it. I'm not a specialist at all. Today I have one guest, tomorrow another. What you've said is clear. Please.
The fact is that all tests of general relativity are based on standard chronology. So, a dilemma arises. Either general relativity must be discarded along with all experiments in nuclear physics, or Fomenko's theory must be discarded. And a second point, it would be best to invite, for example, people from the Sternberg Astronomical Institute. They could explain this whole situation and point out all the specific errors that exist in it.
All right, then we'll invite physicists as well.
As for scholars, there was a scholar named Leonard who received the Nobel Prize and also rejected general relativity. He was rejected by all serious people.
But he did receive the Nobel Prize?
Yes, he did receive the Nobel Prize.
So sometimes the Nobel Prize is awarded.
Sometimes it's awarded to people with Nazi brown shirt ideas as well.
So, one can be awarded the Nobel Prize for radiocarbon dating, and yet it turns out to be wrong? Is that theoretically possible?
No, what Leonard did scientifically was correct, and it was his political and ideological views that became the reason he was rejected.
I see. Unfortunately, this is the first time I've ever heard the name you just mentioned. Since he is a Nobel laureate, it's difficult for me to comment on this. Let's move on to the second question and continue.
My second question is this. Which arguments in Fomenko's works do you consider the most convincing? Astronomical, mathematical, or linguistic?
Once again, I want to say that by asking this question, Yury Nikolaevich proceeds from the assumption that most viewers who watch our Wednesday shows, devoted to Fomenko's theory, have read his works. Otherwise, there is no point in asking such a question. I want to ask you another question about the Tatar-Mongol invasion, which may seem incorrect or meaningless to you from a logical point of view. As I understand it, there was a huge Tatar-Mongol army with a vast amount of weaponry, including cavalry. You may contradict me now. From what I've read in Fomenko, he doesn't know this either. You probably do know. Where was all of this produced? For example, spears. There must have been enormous factories. Where was all this made for a huge army that advanced on Russia and conquered it? Are there any indications of where it was produced?
Perhaps there are. The thing is, and I know this for certain, one should not think that the existence of spears automatically implies the existence of foundries or factories.
Then where did they come from?
They could simply be made in small furnaces. Spears could be made domestically.
But there were countless numbers of them.
And countless numbers can be made as well. Absolutely enormous quantities of items like spears and swords can be made in domestic settings.
So, the Tatar Mongols, yurts, and in those yurts thousands of spears, swords, and arrows were produced? That has never happened in human history.
Wait a moment.
We have 4 minutes left.
Of course, they weren't made in yurts. Presumably there were some specialized setups. But the point is, you don't need, so to speak, a factory with foundations, large halls, cranes, and so on.
You need an industry. Factory or not, to supply an army at war, you need an industry.
But across all of Europe you cannot localize a single factory where spears or arrowheads were produced. That only becomes more or less traceable from the time firearms began to be manufactured. Everything before that, swords and spears, did not even require a workshop.
And where does the metal come from? Where does the ore come from? When we talk about Western Europe, known ore deposits exist, so at least we know where the ore came from. But when the Tatar Mongols attacked, where did everything come from?
Well, as for ore, thank God, there was plenty of it. If you look at the vast expanses of Kazakhstan, you could practically shovel the ore up with a spade.
So, when the Tatar Mongols attacked us, is it known where ore was being mined at that time?
I can't tell you precisely, but I think there really was a lot of ore. If you take the southern Urals, Kazakhstan, and further toward China, there were plenty of places where you could practically shovel the ore up by hand.
Are these places known to historians? That's important.
I don't think this was preserved in any kind of structures. There aren't any. In reality, these were enterprises closer to household production, and they almost certainly left no trace anywhere. There's nothing wrong with that.
Ore was produced in domestic condition.
I'm talking about domestic in the sense that this was not anything like a modern factory, with workshops, large halls, cranes, and so on.
But this was a huge army.
So what? There were very many such dispersed locations.
Please.
Hello, I visited the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, back when one could walk around there freely, and what struck me were the coffins and their very small size. About 1.4 meters, at most 1.5 meters. In that connection, my question is, how can anthropological data be used to date all this?
I see. Thank you. Very briefly, please, if you wish.
This is again the same method we already discussed. There is nothing else. Nothing else has been invented, namely, the radiocarbon method.
I see. Yury Nikolaevich, here is our traditional gift. I'm giving it to you not simply out of goodwill, but so that you remember both our broadcast and our show. I think you have stated your position and answered the question as you see fit, for which many thanks. We are not ending the conversation.
That's very important.
We are not ending the conversation either with Yury Nikolaevich or with others. I've already said that at the beginning of July, Gary Kasparov will be here, and we'll talk with him. In general, we are not ending the discussion about how we write history. As for your poll question, most people believe that the most convincing arguments are astronomical, with mathematical and linguistic ones in second place. It seems to me that perhaps this is partly true, although I don't know which there are more of, mathematical or astronomical arguments. We started all these broadcasts because this topic seems extremely interesting to us. It clearly interests you. We believe that questioning what is accepted is a good thing, not a bad one. When we made this broadcast, from that point of view there were no ideological undertones. It seems to me that Fomenko didn't have any either. You think there were. We say goodbye to you, but we are not really saying goodbye. We will talk about this again. And with that, I, your host, Andrei Maksimov, say goodbye.